Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our class on the life of David. Today we are in lesson 7, looking at David and Abigail. In our Bibles, we're in 1 Samuel 25 is where we're going to find that story. Chapter 25 opens, and we find the end of a fascinating person's life, the end of one of God's greatest servants, Samuel, who has been a leader and a judge for God's people, who has been a voice for God among the people. Samuel, the last judge. Samuel, the one who anointed Saul as king and then confronted Saul over his wickedness and then announced the end of Saul's reign. It was Samuel who also anointed David as the next king of Israel. Well, here in this time of great unrest, Samuel dies, and that wisdom and voice of reason is gone with him. Now, David is still on the run in chapter 25, but from our last chapter, chapter 24, David confronts Saul. He had the opportunity to kill him and didn't. And for a brief moment, emphasis on brief, Saul calls off this manhunt. And so the pursuit for David is temporarily halted, and David and his men, in this meanwhile, hire themselves out as a secretary force out on the open range. They go to protect ranchers and shepherds from the danger that was posed in the wilderness, whether that be wild animals or thieves, what have you. Well, according to the custom of this time, the sheep were sheared at this time, and it was common for the owner of the animals to set aside a portion of his profit that he made and to give it to those who were protecting his livestock, those who had protected his shepherds while they were out in the field. Well, that's the context of 1 Samuel 25. It's that time. It's the sheep shearing season in verse 2. And so David sends some of his men to a certain man that they have been protecting. His name is Nabal. In verse 25, his name means fool, and he certainly lives up to that title. We know about him from verse 2 that he's very rich. He has 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. But we also know in verse 3 more about his character. Though he was rich in wealth and in possessions, he was absolutely broke when it comes to character and integrity. In verse 3, we find that he is dishonest and deceptive and unfair. He is harsh and evil in his dealings. His own servants in verse 17 call him worthless and unapproachable, that no one can talk to him. His own wife admitted to his character in verse 25 that he's a worthless man and he lives up to his name. Well, so that's the man. That's the man where we're talking about here, that David and his men have been protecting. So David sends his servants to Nabal, and you see in verse 6 through 8 how they are supposed to approach this man. And so David has the expectation. He says, "You shall say, have a long life, peace be with you, and peace to your house, and peace be to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Now, your shepherds have been with us, and we have not insulted them, nor have they missed anything all the days that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a festive day. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David." So the servants were to be very respectful, and to make just a humble, simple request to Nabal, asking for whatever they had, whatever he had on hand. Nothing grand. He didn't ask for anything big, just whatever he had on hand. So it was a kind, respectful gesture, very peaceful. They weren't pushy. In fact, it says verse 9 that they waited. They weren't demanding. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that David and his men have been protecting him, and in spite of the fact that they came with this very kind, humble, respectful approach and plea, his response in verse 10, it says, "But Nabal answered David's servant, saying, 'Who is David? And who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered from my shearers and give it to men whose origin I do not know?'" You hear that? I mean, he pretends he's never even heard of David. He pretends he doesn't even know who he is. He lumps him in, characterizes him as if he's this runaway, disobedient slave. You know, it would have been impossible for Nabal to not know who David was, because in verse 30, his own wife knows. His own wife is well aware of David and the situation. But he's so focused on himself. Me, 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 me. My bread, my water, my meat, my shears. It's just all about me. And the reason he doesn't share, the reason he doesn't give is because he's selfish and he's greedy. But this is where things turn from bad to worse because something in David snaps. Just, I mean, maybe his men came at a bad time, at a low time. Maybe David is, again, remember, they're on the run and they're doing good for others. They're trying to use their time even though they're being hunted for others. Maybe they're hungry and tired. Maybe all that all at once is very likely the case because in this moment, David is expecting the men to come back with provisions, a means of saying thank you to the work that they have done. And instead, they come back with the report. And David, was he wronged? Yes. But his response is to grab the swords. To get the men, grab the swords. 400 men would ride down and they will kill all the men. You see verse 13 and verse 22. 13 says, each of you gird on his sword. So each man girded up his swords. And he says in verse 22, says, may God do so to the enemies of David, more also if by morning I leave as much as one male of any who belong to him. David's thinking that's it. We're going, we're slinging swords, we're chopping down. Well, you ask us what happened? What happened to David? What happened to the cool, calm, collected, self-controlled David of chapter 24? Because in chapter 24, he was able to withhold the temptation of taking Saul's life. And in comparison, Saul has done far worse to David than Nabal. I mean, Nabal insulted him. Nabal withheld provisions from him. But let's be honest, none of that compares to what Saul's done. Saul has been relentlessly hunting and searching after David. Saul has killed people because he cannot find David. And yet David was able to be in control in chapter 24 and to not take his vengeance out on Saul. But something's different here. In fact, one author says it this way. He says, David, what's wrong with you? Why, one of the most wonderful things we have learned about you recently is your patience with Saul. You learned to wait on the Lord. You refused to lift your hand to touch the Lord's anointed, although he had been your enemy for so many years. But now look at you. Your self-restraint has gone to pieces, and a few insulting words from a fool of a man like Nabal has made you see red. David, what's the matter? I am justified in doing this, David would reply. There's no reason why Nabal should treat me as he has. He has repaid all my kindness with insults. I will show him that he can't trifle with me. It's one thing to take it from Saul, who is my superior at this point. But this sort of man, this high-handed individual, must be taught a lesson. It's a lesson here. There's a lesson worth learning, and that is you cannot live today on yesterday's victories. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12, therefore, let him who stands take heed lest he fall. So just because I've overcome a temptation yesterday, and I was strong yesterday, doesn't mean I can just take it easy. Doesn't mean that I'm guaranteed to win the battle today. You have to be just as strong, just as vigilant, just as aware today, just as sober-minded today as I was yesterday. And David, for whatever reason, maybe it's all those things together. Maybe it's just the weariness of the road, tired, hungry. Maybe it's just the fact of who said it at that time and he wasn't expecting it. David does not show that same restraint and self-control he showed the chapter before. But that's when something incredible happens here. You see, the person who really shows us a beautiful example of faith and devotion and doing the right thing it's not David in this chapter. No, it's who stands in David's way. It's Abigail. Abigail is described in verse 2 as intelligent and beautiful in appearance. She's lovely inside and outside. David later on in verse 33 is going to praise her for her discernment. And so she is really the complete opposite of her husband. She is wise and clear thinking and lovely. She's beautiful. You know, it's remarkable that Abigail retains her dignity and keeps her marriage. She continued to honor her marriage vows in spite of her husband's foolishness. I mean, we might ask the question, I don't know if you wondered it or not, but how do Abigails end up with Nabal's? How does that happen? I mean, surely at this time, arranged marriages were the norm. Prearranged marriages happened, and we still see today where women of excellence, women of character, women of wisdom, sometimes end up marrying the complete opposite. Sometimes opposites attract. Sometimes it's women like Abigail who feel so pitiful for those who are like Nabal and they believe that they can help them and strengthen them and fix them. But what a contrast between Abigail and Nabal. Their temperaments are different, their behaviors are different, their attitudes are different, the way they treat others is different. They could not be more different, more opposite than each other. Well, verse 14, the messengers come to Abigail, not to Nabal. Tells you something there, doesn't it? Because in verse 17, they know that no one can talk to him. No one can speak to this man. He's just not approachable. Well, here she is told of the good that David has done, verse 15 and verse 16, and yet how absolutely rude his servants were treated. And they also told from verse 17 what David had intended to do. And so she doesn't waste a moment. You notice in verse 19, she doesn't tell her husband what she's planning to do. It's not that she's hiding it from him in terms of just deceit, as much as it is a woman who is acting out of the best interest of her husband. Had she told him, he would not let her do it. Had she told him, he would have buckled down, but she knew the right response, and it was not to get his permission. It was not to tell him. It was just to act. And so she went ahead and arranged his plan on his behalf, and literally she saves his life. You look at verse 18, what she gathers is 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, 500 measures of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. I mean, she comes with a feast. She comes with a feast because she is about to face off against 400 angry, hungry, vengeful warriors. And so she's got to come with a full arsenal to feed that hunger and satisfy that anger. So she takes these gifts to David. She takes them on her own with the servants, and she takes them to David. And when she finds them, when she approaches them, you notice her response, verse 24. Really, this is down from verse 24 to 31. She comes to David and she bows low, and she gives this incredible speech, this amazing speech. You just notice her tact 6 times. Verse 24, 25, 27, 28, and 31. She calls herself maidservant. But 8 times, she calls David my Lord. 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 30, and 31. She calls him Lord. You just notice the tact, the respect that she pours on David. You also notice from verse 24 and 25, she blames herself. Look at that with me. 24, it says, she fell at his feet and says, on me alone, my Lord, be the blame. And please let your maidservant speak to you and listen to the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my Lord pay attention to this worthless man Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and father is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you have sent. She takes the blame on herself. She tells David, don't pay attention to my husband. He acted like a fool. She doesn't just dismiss what Nabal did. It's obvious he acted foolishly. He acted incorrectly, and she attributes that. But she shares in the guilt. She says, I wasn't aware, and had I known, had I only had known, it wouldn't have been this way, David. I hope you understand that. And she asks for forgiveness in verse 28. It's not her fault. It was her husband's fault. But she steps in the way. She steps in the path of David's vengeance in order to save her husband. It's amazing, isn't it? You just stop and think for a minute. And maybe this is a good sober reminder about things today. How easy would it have been when David was going to come down and the servants of Nabal heard about it? How easy would it have been for Abigail to go into her room and to pray and to simply let her husband face whatever fate that he brought upon himself? How easy would that have been? She's been living with this foolish man, this inconsiderate, rude, selfish man. How easy would it have been for her just to let him die and then to live off of his wealth the rest of her life? He's getting what he deserves. But that's not her. She seeks the best of her husband, even when her husband, we might say, doesn't even deserve it. Doesn't even deserve it. And she also seeks the best interest of David. It's just such a great lesson for us here about seeking the best interest of others, even those who have treated me poorly. And then a great lesson about marriage, about sticking with it with your mate, about seeking their best interest, about putting their needs before your own. Here is a woman who is married to a miserable man, and yet she's still saving his life. She's caring for him as if for her own. She lived out Proverbs 3 verse 27, do not withhold good from whom it's due when it's in your power to do it. And she knew it. She could be the one to save Nabal and to save David. And she does. And that's really the thing is that you notice in everything that she's doing here, it's not just to save her husband and for all the men that David and his warriors were going to kill, but she also did this for David. Almost as if to say, don't do this, David. Don't let it mar your record with murder. Yes, you've been wronged, but listen, personal vengeance is not the answer here. Leave this in the hands of God. Don't come to the throne, which you're going to come to, but don't come to the throne with this blood on your hands. Because in verse 30 and 31, you're going to have to live with this for the rest of your life, David. And you don't need that. You don't need this. You don't need this guilt going to be weighing on your heart. You notice the statements of faith that she makes here, such incredible faith. Verse 28, David will have an enduring house or rule in Israel. Verse 29, David will survive his enemies, and his enemies will fail. Like tossed from a sling. Isn't that interesting? Tossed from a sling. She must have heard about Goliath. David, in verse 30, will be the king just as God has promised him. And she makes the humble request. Verse 31, she says, my Lord, when the Lord deals well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. When he does well with you, remember me. Remember me fondly. You know, there's a lesson here as well, maybe a side lesson, a side thought here, and that is when you think about confrontation, we hate confrontation. We tend to shy away from it. It's easier just to overlook an offense and to let my feelings be hurt than to address a person's wrongdoings. I believe many are hesitant just because they don't want to stir the water. They're afraid of the blowback. It's awkward. It's so awkward to point out another person's faults, and you don't know how they're going to respond. But it's in this lesson we learned a lot about how to handle times of conflict. Because here comes Abigail, and she diffuses the tension in David and his men by how she speaks to him. You think of Nabal, the fool. Well, Proverbs chapter 18, verse 6 and 7 says, a fool's lips bring strife, and his mouth calls for blows. A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are the snare of his soul. Doesn't that sound like Nabal? The way he responded to David's servants brought on great harm, brought on a great damage, brought on the threat of death from David and his men. But you compare that with Abigail, who walks in wisdom. Proverbs 15, verse 1, a gentle answer turns away wrath. Proverbs 16, verse 13, righteous lips are the delight of kings, and he who speaks it right is loved. Proverbs 16, verse 21, the wise in heart will be called understanding, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Isn't that something? Sweet speech brings persuasiveness. You win the argument. You win the heart when you speak, not with boldness and sharpness, but with sweetness. Proverbs 16 and verse 7, when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. And you think about Abigail and how she applies to all those. She's walking with the Lord. She is kind and respectful and sweet in the way that she is speaking to David. She's gentle in her approach, not dogmatic. I mean, imagine how she responded like Nabal, come out and said, you fool, are you really going to do this? Are you really going to take his life? That's such a dumb response, David. She might have lost her life there too. No. But she came so very gently and kind and courteous. She spoke words of faith. She spoke words of respect. And she won David's heart. Abigail reminds us about carrying the right demeanor when confronting others. Paul reminds us in Galatians 6 and verse 1 and 2 that if anyone is caught in any trespass, restore such a one But he tags it there. Restore such a one, not singeing them back to the right with the calling down the fires of heaven. But he says, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. It's just think of this. Think how you would want someone to address you if you were in the wrong. Do you want someone cramming down your throat? Would you want someone punching you between the eyes? Or would you want someone to be thoughtful, kind, and compassionate and reaching out to you like a loved one saying, I'm worried about you. I'm concerned about you and I want you to be right. I want you back in the right. Well, that's one of the highlights from this text. David shows us again here why he is called a man after God's own heart. He's not only listens to Abigail here, but he changes. From 32 to 35, David says to Abigail, blessed be the Lord God of Israel who has sent you to meet me. And blessed be your discernment. And blessed be you who have kept me from this day from bloodshed, from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you had come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left to Nabal until the morning light as much as one nail. So David received from her hand what she had brought, and said to her, go up to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request. And so he listens and he changes. That's just one so very marvelous thing about David, is that he just has this teachable spirit. He changes his entire demeanor. He shows that he is able and willing to listen, to learn, to be corrected, and to change. And so this future king, this man of war, he listens to the requests and the words of this kind and sweet woman. And he not only hears her, but he listens and accepts the truth when it's spoken. You see, David here models true and genuine humility. And so what happens that when Abigail returns home after her encounter with the future king, she returns home to find her husband throwing a party for himself as if he is a king. Verse 36. He's so drunk. He is so drunk that Abigail has to wait until the next day to talk with him. And I don't know, it's not mentioned here, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Did she go to bed weary and tired and wounded? Did she cry herself to sleep that night, wondering what it would be like to be married to a spouse who treated her the way that she deserved, who honored her and cared for her and treated her special, a spouse that she wouldn't have to do this for, a spouse that was respectful and honored God and feared the Lord, because she pleaded for David to leave things in the hands of God, and she did, and he did, but she had to go home, back home to a fool who had no idea what she had done. Well, the next day, she shares it. She shares the information. She shares with Nabal David's plot, and then her intervention. And from all this news, he has what we could imagine to be a stroke or a heart attack, and then 10 days later he dies. 37 to 38 are verses here. And then comes the beautiful ending here, and that is that David hears the news of this, and without a hesitation, he sends to her a marriage proposal, and the two are married. It's a beautiful end, isn't it? The sad thing is not everyone gets to have that kind of an ending. There are some who may be married to some like Nabal, and that end doesn't happen. They continue to be married to a person who makes life difficult for them. And Abigail provides an immense example of continuing to love and to serve and be faithful to your mate, even in the times like that they're living like they don't deserve it, even in the times when they are not who they ought to be. But you think here, at least just in our context about David, can you imagine from this scene, what did David learn here that would help him to become a king, help him as a king? Well, again, go back to the point, you can't live today on yesterday's victories. So just because you were strong once before, just because you were victorious before, doesn't mean you can't do so or will do so today. He learned to listen to the voice of truth wherever it came from. And here it came from a humble, very, very sweet and tender woman. And so David had a teachable heart, and that will play him well when he becomes a king. And then here he learned to be patient when he was wronged, to leave things into the hand of God. And that will help him. And he will learn to employ that same kind of strategy when he becomes a king. This will be an important lesson that he learned here. But I'll end with this. Abigail, of all people in this chapter, it's Abigail who shows us the example of Jesus. I mean, typically, we look to David, and we looked at David's example as to how he shows us Christ, how he emulates Christ. But in this story, it's not David, it's Abigail. Because Abigail places herself between David and Nabal, just as Jesus placed himself between us and God and the wrath that we deserved. Abigail volunteered to be punished for Nabal's sins, and Jesus allowed heaven to punish him for mine and your sins. And Abigail turned away the anger of David, just as Christ shielded us from the wrath of God. And so, as one author would write, do you find your Nabal world so hard to stomach? Then do what David did. Stop staring at Nabal. Shift your gaze to Christ. Look more at the mediator and less at the troublemakers. Don't let evil get the best of you. Get the best of evil by doing good. Romans 12:21. One prisoner can change a camp. One Abigail can save a family. Be the beauty amidst your beasts and see what happens. And that can be us today. Put your eyes on Christ. And even if you're in a tough life situation, maybe a tough marriage, maybe a tough work environment, don't focus on the Nabals. Focus on Christ and bring the beauty of Christ wherever it is that you are. Keep on doing the right thing. Keep on serving. Keep on loving. Keep on setting that good example. And who knows? Maybe like Abigail, through just her sweet, kind example and doing the right thing, you can change the hearts and the lives of those around you, just like David's heart was touched and changed. Thank you so much for studying with me today. If you see something or saw something and have learned something through the study, I'd love to hear from you. And so send me a message. If you got any questions, send me your questions, and I'd love to talk about this with you. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to you coming back and studying with us soon. Bye-bye.